You're listening to The Means of Production, the origin story of WRIR and community-powered radio in Richmond. I'm Whitney Whiting.
WRIR is one of my calendar markers. By the time RIR was going on the air, I would say the dungeon walls had been breached.
I grew up in the era of punk rock, so everything is DIY and I'm happy with it.
It doesn't matter if you're good enough. You don't have to be good enough. What you have to do is show up and do it.
In the spring of 1998, a tiny micro transmitter started broadcasting from a typical Richmond row house to the surrounding neighborhood.
You're listening to Free Radio Oregon Hill, your 100% ethyl-free radio station, keeping resistance alive in Richmond.
The announcer called it Free Radio Oregon Hill, but it might have been transmitting from any of Richmond's many neighborhoods. The Fan, Church Hill, maybe Jackson Ward.
Radio Free Oregon Hill would like to remind you, fight the oppressor. We're gunning for you, parking authority. Fight the corporation. Liberate the neighborhoods. Bring back Richmond. Radio Free Oregon Hill.
The whole point was that you wouldn't know where it was coming from, and neither, hopefully, would the FCC, because this was pirate radio, and it was 100% illegal. Welcome to The Means of Production. For episode 2, we're going to travel back in time to the Richmond of the 80s and 90s, a time of pushing the boundaries in local music, art, and independent radio. The voices you'll hear in this episode were all experimenting with some form of independent media, but they had no idea it would eventually lead to a station like WRIR. Back then, people like Don Harrison were just doing what they loved.
Well, I think that it was responding to the fact that radio sucked, and everyone knew it, and everyone talked about it. It was no secret.
It wasn't so much that was bad, it's just dull. They weren't doing anything interesting, certainly not with the music lineup. And you ask anybody that likes good music, particularly at WRIR, they're going to say it was a desert.
Jack R. Johnson, producer of WRIR's long-running series Hidden Histories, arrived in Richmond in 1983 to a city that, on the surface, most of us would barely recognize today.
In the 80s, early 80s in particular, and even earlier, Gray Street, right along here, there was a sort of seediness to the Fan in particular.
This was Richmond pre-gentrification. Some described the city at this time as being apocalyptic. Whole neighborhoods gutted after decades of white flight and disinvestment. Hundreds of abandoned buildings. Downtown was a ghost town compared to today. But not everyone saw this as a bad thing. There was at least one aspect about Richmond in the 80s and 90s that was pretty cool. Rent was cheap, and there was room to actually play. Here's WRIR co-founder Fareed Allen Shinsius.
RIR and a flood of other creations are literally a who's who of Richmond institutions now, mutually supporting collaborative creation stories, creation endeavors, all popped up at the same time. So that's when, we went from a pinhole here and there to what the phase of the dungeon energy, just like a dam. It reaches a certain point where there's momentum, where the work doesn't have to be done, it tears itself apart. That's what that phase was. It was a gush time period.
And all of that was bubbling up. And the reason it was able to bubble up is because it was livable. And that's the key, actually. You could stay here for $300, $400 a month, do your art, and not have to become, a corporate hog or whatever in order to just survive. You could just do what you really wanted to do. And I was able to. I was able to keep my body and soul together because it wasn't too expensive. And that allowed me to do other creative things, like investing my time in WRIR.
We'll hear more about the different experiments with radio later in this episode, but for now, I want to return to one individual who was also experimenting, someone we met in episode 1. His name is Christopher Maxwell.
I was not the best person to build LPFM. There are way more knowledgeable people than me. I just decided every day, I'm going to do something about this.
I first met Chris Maxwell in the summer of 1999. I was running a little anarchist coffee shop on Harrison Street, which is where Harrison Street Cafe is now. It was called Utopia Cafe and Info Shop, which is such a late 90s activist coffee shop kind of a name.
Back then, future RIR DJ Dustin Richardson was playing mixtapes for his kitchen staff in the heart of Richmond's fan district, and serving a steady stream of unique individuals and groups with a cause.
Because this, obviously pre-internet, the only way that people knew what was going on were bulletin boards at coffee shops, that sort of thing, or notices in Punchline magazine, or, just word of mouth, right? And so we had a number of groups that would have their weekly meetings in my coffee shop. General Strike Collective, there was the Lesbian Avengers, there were a couple other, Food Not Bombs had their meetings in our store. These were great communities that were coming up in Richmond. I was happy to see them. And then we also had just, weird one-off folks with a cause. Another one of these people that would come by was this wild-eyed guy with glasses and a big signboard that said Radio Free Richmond. And he'd wear it like a sandwich board sometimes, I think, if memory serves me.
I don't present myself with grand highfalutin titles. Plus, I don't have any formal training. So I don't have any paper certifications for any of this stuff. And in fact, that's sort of my superpower in the sense that, on many occasions, people have said some variation of, well, who are you to say things should be this way or that way? And I'm like, just somebody, just a person.
The official origins of Max's quest for better radio have almost become Richmond folklore, and we heard a version of this story at the end of episode 1, complete with an ironic flourishing of dollar bills, a pounding of gavels, and an irate WCVE station manager challenging Max to just start his own radio station. But as legendary as this story is, I think it gives too much credit to WCVE for setting Max down this path. This wasn't a challenge he accepted out of the blue in an effort to prove something to the so-called experts. Whether he knew it then or not, Max had been on this path long before he stepped into that WCVE board meeting. He'd always been a just-do-it-yourself kind of person, and sometimes that path can be a lonely one at first.
I wouldn't have done most of those things if I had had a better integrated personality, honestly. I needed a personality transplant. I was not a happy teenager. I was just not happy. It did not seem there was any place in the world for me. And it was talk radio that saved my life.
Max was a teenager in West Palm Beach, Florida, on the floor of his first job, when he heard talk radio for the very first time. His boss wouldn't listen to anything else.
At the start, it was torture, because I wanted music, right? And I did not like the same music he did. So he's forcing us to listen to talk radio. After about 2 weeks, I was starting to get into it. I was like, oh, I never heard that. Is that true? And then I'd go to the public library, right? This is pre-internet. I'd go to the library and look up the thing that I wondered, and oh my God, that's true. So suddenly the door starts opening that there's this whole world of information flow that is not coming to you from the official sources. It's not in the Britannica. It's not in the school syllabus. You're never going to hear it from the authorities.
One day, Max and his coworkers were listening to AM station WJNO when host Jack Cole introduced his guest for the day. It was President Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, and Max had a question.
I'm like 16. I got on the air for 20 seconds. The Secretary of State answered, and then comes the cool part. Other adults calling in from the community, and for some reason, somehow, what I said was all of a sudden I became the topic of conversation for about 5 to 7 minutes, where like 3 or 4, maybe it was 5 people called in. One person said, oh, what a wise kid. Another person was like, what a brat. How dare he ask such an impertinent question? And of course, I'm like, yeah. I'm happy that the guy was pissed off at me. Like, yeah, that was impertinent. Thank you. And I loved Both sides. I loved it that the pebble made a wave. And whether the other people hated me or liked me didn't actually matter. What mattered was, maybe there is a place in the world for me. For 20 seconds, I made a little wave in this little corner of the world. Maybe I do belong on this planet.
So at 16, Max got a glimpse of a world that he wanted to be a part of. The next step on his path, actual AM radio.
I worked at WPBR 1340 AM down in Florida. I sold advertisements, I ran the mix board, I edited the tapes on a reel-to-reel machine with a razor blade. This was old school AM, 40-year-old technology, vacuum tubes everywhere, right? So I cut my teeth in literal bargain basement AM talk radio.
At WPBR, Max learned something about radio that would influence his media journey more than anything he'd ever learn in a VCU mass communications class. He saw firsthand why some voices get left out and some viewpoints are overrepresented. According to Max, it all came down to money, but not in the way you might think.
The reason that the right-wing talk show hosts are so dominant on AM broadcast is not because the owners are right-wing, although that's a factor, because you can't sell ads on liberal shows. I had a right-winger, I had a buffoon, and I had a left-winger that I sold advertisements for.
The smaller businesses, says Max, were willing to advertise anywhere if it meant they could get more customers. They just didn't have the budget. But the mid-sized businesses, the ones that had the money to advertise,
they're almost solidly hard, way to the right of Newt Gingrich Republicans. And I would go to them and say, yeah, we're selling ads, you want to bring some customers in, and I got 3 different types of talk shows for you to advertise on. And he would say, I don't want any of my money going to anything except conservatives. I'm like, you're losing half your potential population to come and buy stuff from you. He's like, I don't care. And I asked this question many times, and I almost always got the same answer. I said, let me get this straight. You're saying you would rather lose potential customers than advertise where they're listening? And he'd say, yes. So the filter mechanism is going in the opposite direction than most people assume it is. Most people assume, oh, well, they want listeners, so they're going to put up right-wing talk show hosts because that's who's listening. I'm like, no, that's actually not what's happening. What's actually happening is you have a wide variety of listeners who will listen to anything that's of any reasonable quality at least once. No, you can't sell ads. You can't support the liberal talk shows. The only place they get to exist is on a place where people are the primary source of money, which would be community, some religious, some college, definitely community radio stations. And that was my epiphany. I have to make a space for it to happen. And that space will not happen on commercial media. I decided I was just going to find whatever channel I could to do stuff. And I realized, oh, cable public access is a thing. So I had an old vacuum tube camcorder with literally a motorcycle battery strapped to my waist to power it because the onboard battery was dead. I would go out and go to city council meetings with that rig, and I would follow politicians around with it because the motorcycle battery would power that thing for 2 or 3 hours straight.
By now, Max had made his way to Richmond, Virginia, and while he already had a wealth of experience from his AM radio days, he started taking classes at VCU to get the proper training.
What's crazy is I went into one of the production classes, a class in production, where you'd expect to get your little fingers on actual equipment, right? Because it's called production. And I go in there and they're like, oh, if you're all little good boys and girls, maybe we'll let you touch some of the equipment at the end of the semester. We'll make something that goes on PBS at 3 in the morning. And I raised my hand. And of course, by now I had a reputation. So you could see them going, oh God, what's he gonna say? And I owned equipment. I mean, it wasn't great equipment, but I had the means of production. And I said, well, I already own the means of production. They're not as nice as yours, but I'm making shows every week right now. Why don't we just start making shows with my stuff? Or let me use your stuff and I'll just put it on my show slot. He looked so horrified. And he was like, well, you're not going to know what to do. I'm like, what's wrong with that? Like, you got to learn somewhere. Why don't we just do it and make mistakes and learn from them? I'm like, let's do it. Let's just throw ourselves to the wolves.
So when WCVE slammed their gavel on Max and told him to start his own station, it was no big leap for him. It was the exact push he needed.
All right, I got the message. Make your own. All right, I'll do that. I've got what I need. All I need is money. So I'd already been talking about it on public access. I figured, all right, let's just start gathering the money together. How much does it cost? I'm like, well, let's see. It's going to be about $10,000 for this. So I started talking to people about getting the money together. And what I didn't fully get at that time was you do not talk about engineering in the open. Because at that time, the FCC was just like, apply whenever you want to. And so because I stupidly and naively announced 300 watts at 89.3, the Christians were like, okay. Yeah, so they got that frequency. I realized that there were no frequencies left for full power. So at that point, I'm just like, what am I going to do about that? And that's where other people are having their versions of the same experience. I was hardly the only one.
Max started realizing that he wasn't alone anymore. There was a whole movement of people out there, in Richmond and beyond, experimenting with community-driven independent media. They were seeing the same things Max was seeing, and they were organizing, filling the gap of underrepresented news, music, and voices.
I was living in an activist household with a whole bunch of people that were involved in either ACT UP, working on AIDS issues, or prison reform, or environmentalism, or whatever else. My name is Pete Treatish. I was part of Radio Mutiny in West Philadelphia as a pirate. And then I went on to found the Prometheus Radio Project, which helped to bring about the legalization of the community radio low power FM service.
Pete and his friends saw radio as the perfect medium for sharing the community voices and stories that traditional media was ignoring. Back then, radio was way more accessible than the internet, which was still very new and very slow. Radio is an old technology, but it's fairly simple to set up if you have the means. There's just one little problem. The FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, makes it very difficult for the average person to get a license to broadcast legally. The phrase radio pirate makes it sound like Pete and other broadcasters were stealing something that didn't belong to them. But the media activists believed that the airwaves belonged to everyone. And in 1993, one very important legal case would catch the attention of radio pirates everywhere. Stephen Dunifer, an anti-war activist, had been roaming the hills of Berkeley, California, broadcasting from a handmade 10-watt transmitter in his backpack when he was caught by the FCC.
Stephen went on the air in protest of the Gulf War, and he got busted. They figured out who he was, and they fined him, and he didn't have any money, so they couldn't collect the fine. And he was just a particularly willful kind of an individual, so he just kept on going and kept on broadcasting. He had a backpack. He was broadcasting from the hills.
In lieu of his ability to pay the fines, the FCC went to Judge Claudia Wilkin for an injunction against Dunifer to bar him from broadcasting.
And the lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild, they put forward a pretty good legal argument.
Dunifer's legal team essentially argued a free speech First Amendment case. They acknowledged the FCC's need to abridge some First Amendment rights simply because of the physical limitations of space on a given frequency band.
Because you can only have so many radio stations on the air before they all just bleed over each other and, no one can hear anything. So they do have that right. However, they are supposed to do so with the means that is the least harmful to the First Amendment interests of the citizens in general. So, when they are making order out of that chaos, they are supposed to do it in the way that creates the most opportunity and the most different voices. And what the lawyer said to the judge is okay, so you're telling me that Clear Channel owning 1,200 radio stations across the country, whereas my client has no realistic opportunity to even be on any of them, is the thing that's least restrictive of the First Amendment. And the judge said, well, I hadn't thought about it like that. I'm going to have to consider this. And she didn't rule. And she said, but I don't see any harm in the immediate future in Mr. Dunifer continuing to broadcast with his 10-watt transmitter in his backpack. And we'll just leave it like that until I can really think the case through. And the FCC said, Judge Wilkin, you're opening up a giant can of worms. You don't understand what you just did. And Dunifer went ahead. He opened a storefront. He didn't go up in the hills with a backpack anymore. He opened a storefront. And within a few months, he had 100 programmers on the air and, a full schedule and a studio. And, the whole time they were waiting for the injunction to come.
But the judge's ruling didn't come, not for another 4 years. The Stephen Dunifer Free Radio Berkeley case brought tons of attention to radio piracy and opened the floodgates for new pirates like Pete, who saw a huge opportunity when the judge postponed her final decision. Judge Wilkin eventually did rule against Dunifer on a technicality, but the can of worms had been opened.
Meantime, in his wake, 1,000 pirate stations had opened across the country. We all figured, well, if someone's going to get in trouble, it'll be Stephen first before they can get to us. So we could always just shut down later.
But Pete and his band of pirates didn't shut down. Even in the face of their own harassment from the FCC, they used it to grow.
The biggest thing that we said that for every station that the FCC harassed, like us, we would go on the road and show people how to build 10 more pirate radio stations. But I started doing that. I started going on tour around up and down the East Coast and just visiting anarchist bookstores and schools and just whoever I knew and showing people how to do pirate radio stations.
The new radio pirates had started a movement that would soon prove to be unstoppable. Technology was changing. Pirates were able to find or make higher quality transmitters that stayed on frequency, limiting interference with other broadcasters and thus interference from the FCC. The internet allowed people to share how-to guides and connect with each other like never before. And also, it was just fun.
Radio Free Oregon Hill. If you can hear this, we're on the air.
Hey, you're listening to Free Radio Oregon Hill. Don't forget to go down to Plan 9 in Carytown and buy our t-shirts before we go to jail.
This is before streaming, before cell phones, before people were trading tapes, cassettes in the mail. People were finding different ways to get stories out that seem so antiquated now.
That's one of the former pirate voices of Free Radio Oregon Hill, though they've been off the air for decades now, and officially, they were never on it.
People were trying it out themselves. A lot of the DIY culture, thrived with that. So now you had some guy in Florida saying, hey, this is where you can buy a small transmitter. This is how you can change it to operate as a pirate. And these are the things you need to watch out for. And, you take the chance, you put it on the air, you get a omnidirectional antenna, and next thing you know, you're able to broadcast maybe 5 miles. And maybe you have a friend who's a little more technically savvy, can do some soldering. And next thing you know, you're broadcasting through most of the city. And that was crazy for the time. Cause it was you're taking a chance, but you're also reaching all these people, and all these people are getting wise to it and learning about it and loving it. That you're playing, different types of music and different types of things that they're not gonna hear normally.
I love radio, so I heard about this pirate station, and I came and did a show in someone's house for a year. It was a long time, once a week. I'm Don Harrison, and I co-hosted Open Source RVA here on WRIR for 12 years. Well, you got to think that right around that same time, Richmond was having a real renaissance with punk rock. The 80s were really rich with a lot of local bands that were not only filling the clubs here, but were actually having some impact nationally. So I think there was a pent-up energy towards this. And it probably could have happened sooner if what I call the gatekeepers hadn't been so entrenched.
Hi, you've been listening to Free Radio Oregon Hill. We have been playing the following CDs for you. We have the Meat Puppets live in Montana. We've also heard Mad Professor's new one, Dubtronic. This is on Ross Records and contains lots of crazy reggae disco sounds. And King Sunny A Day with his new one.
You know, Juju music from Africa next to the latest punk rock, next to latest Bad Manners album, latest local albums. And people got a thrill from hearing local music on the radio, their band playing on the radio, right?
Anytime we would listen to something like that, you'd get this connection to the city that you wouldn't get through just random blasé corporate radio, right? You'd actually feel like, oh, that's a person. That's probably a neighbor of mine, you know. Oh, and what they're talking about is the stuff that's going on, you know. And it sort of felt, that sort of thing felt like it was very much tied in with all of those groups that used to meet in my coffee shop.
See, that was the thing, is that you could do this in the ether, and that's not fun for me. But I knew that there were actually people out there listening to this, no matter how rudimentary or crappy the setup, that people were listening to this music, and so that really helped.
How did you know people were listening?
Because they would tell me, and they would. There was sort of a buzz. It was sort of like a wink, because you couldn't talk about it too much. So I liked that there was this clandestine thing that people were digging together.
I think there was a sense that if we angered the media establishment here, that we would get the FCC knock, so to speak. And, eventually as we become more notorious, one of the TV stations did a story on us. And I knew at that point that we'd have to be more careful. We knew we couldn't have as many people involved. We knew we couldn't have that much of an apparatus.
Free Radio Oregon Hill would like to take this moment to say hello and salute Black Liberation Radio. Their station can usually be heard on 91.7 FM in the downtown Richmond area. We just want to say thanks for being there.
As thrilling as pirate radio was for those involved, it couldn't last forever. It also, more importantly, couldn't be a safe outlet for those voices most in need of the airwaves. And while the FCC would eventually ban radio pirates from being official license holders or board members of future LPFM stations, the role of the pirates, people like Stephen Dunifer, Pete Treatish, and others, would prove crucial to the establishment of low-power FM. More to come in the next episode of The Means of Production.
You're listening to Free Radio Oregon Hill. I told them not to do it.
Special thanks to all the radio rebels heard in this episode: Jack R. Johnson, Dustin Richardson, Fareed Allen Shinsius, Christopher Maxwell, Don Harrison, Pete Treatish, and Jessica Martin. Yes, there was a woman in this episode. There were women in DIY radio. You'll hear more from Jessica soon, I promise. This episode featured music from the Free Music Archive, including tracks by Taylor Hobynum, Tomas Fujiwara Duo, Lobo Loco, Barnacled, and Nozu. Until next time, I'm Whitney Whiting, reminding you that another Richmond is possible.